I hope you're enjoying your time in Mexico City. So my paper is titled Aquinas' Reception of Albert the Great's Account of the Virtue of Religion. Introduction. Recent studies have focused on diverse aspects of Aquinas' philosophical account of natural religion. Few, however, have delved into Aquinas' use of his sources, especially his more immediate predecessors in dealing with this topic. This paper seeks to make a contribution in this regard by showing how Albert, his teacher, addressed these questions and prepared the way for Aquinas' more sophisticated account. The paper aims to shed light on some of the decisions that Aquinas had to make when faced with Albert's account of latria. Aquinas seems to think that Albert's arguments settle some issues, but surprisingly he often disagrees with Albert and offers alternative approaches. In particular, we see that for Thomas, Albert settled definitively the question of how religio or latria is to be entirely categorized under the virtue of justice, following the authority of Cicero, and not under the theological virtues, as earlier predecessors had suggested in light of Augustine's teachings, an issue that has important ramifications for the very possibility of a philosophical account of religious worship. Aquinas takes a step further by fully identifying religio and latria, a move which Albert himself does not make. But we also see how in Aquinas' mind, Albert does not quite offer a satisfactory account of the range of action of the virtue of religion. Whereas for Albert, there are many virtuous acts that are entirely outside of the virtue of latria. For Aquinas, any act of a moral virtue can become also a commanded act of the virtue of religio. The two authors also differ significantly in the amount of detail in which they explain the distinction and relationship between latria and the theological virtues. Ultimately, the paper highlights both the originality of Aquinas' account of religion and his debt to his master Albert on the issue. The paper will consist in 3 sections. In the first section, I shall examine how Aquinas is indebted to Albert, and with regards to his theory of religious worship, which represents a radical recontextualization of the discussion among his predecessors and contemporaries concerning a possible rapprochement between the Ciceronian notion of religion and the Augustinian understanding of latria. In the second section, I shall show how Albert and Aquinas depart company when it comes to the issue of the scope of the virtue of latria or religio. In the third section, I shall briefly discuss how Aquinas and Albert address the relationship between religio and the theological virtues, especially charity, emphasizing Aquinas' development of Albert's thought on the issue. In the conclusion, I shall highlight both the originality of Aquinas' account of religion and his debt to his master Albert. A brief word about the text being used. Albert's Summa Theologiae is unfinished and does not include the section on the parts of justice, one of which is latria. All we have of Albert concerning latria are his remarks in his commentary on the sentences, Book 3, Distinction 9, which is an early text. As a result, we can only speculate as to what the mature Albert might have said on the nature of religious worship. By comparison, we have not only the corresponding text of Aquinas' commentary on the sentences, but also other important and more mature texts, primarily his Summa Theologiae, Secunda Secundae, questions 81 through 100, where he discusses the virtue of religio at length, as well as other texts, such as the Summa Contra Gentiles and his commentary on Boethius' De Trinitate, where he discusses religious worship, or cultus, and related topics. As a result, the comparison between these two thinkers will be admittedly uneven. That said, practically all of the relevant details of Aquinas' view are already in some way present in the sentences commentary. So even if we consider only their sentences commentaries, between Albert and Aquinas we see both dependence and significant differences in their views on religious worship. For this reason, the comparison is still very telling and helps us appreciate not only the novelty and originality of Aquinas' account, but also his debt to Albert. Section 1, Religio and Latria, a rapprochement of sources. The nature of latria was an obligatory topic for every medieval magister who commented on Peter Lombard's sentences. In the third book, Lombard addresses the issue of whether the body of Christ, which is itself a creature, should be worshipped with latria or only with dulia. Many magistri address the question by first offering an account of the nature of latria and dulia in general, so they could then explain how these concepts apply to the particular issue of worshipping Christ's body. As a result, there is a wealth of primary source material on the nature of religious worship in the 13th century. Among these accounts, the best known in current scholarship is Aquinas'. His approach fundamentally consists in identifying the Augustinian term latria with Cicero's virtue of religio. He takes his definition of worship from Cicero. Religio is that part of the virtue of justice that, quote, offers care and reverence to a certain superior nature which they call divine, end quote. And it should not be surprising that Aquinas is here following Albert quite closely, not only in citing Cicero as a source for this definition, but in definitively categorizing latria as a part of justice. Speaking of latria, Albert says, quote, it must be said with Cicero that it is a part of justice, and it falls within that part of justice that is religio. For thus says Cicero at the end of his first rhetoric, where he claims religion is a part of justice, because religion is that which offers care and ceremonies to a certain superior nature which they call divine, end quote. These lines may seem uncontroversial if we read them without an awareness of the history of the question on the nature of religious worship. At first glance, we might get the impression that Albert, and later Aquinas, are simply being good medieval scholars in following Cicero as the authority on the question and nothing more. But behind these words there is actually an entire history of considerable philosophical effort invested by Albert's predecessors and contemporaries to reach a synthesis among sources on the topic, and Albert's words are deliberately undoing that synthesis. De Ponton very succinctly highlights how these words, full of power, struck the edifice of the synthesis that earlier medieval thinkers had labored to erect. He says, St. Albert in one line undoes all this work. In citing Cicero in the way they do, Albert and Aquinas are really making a rather blunt decision. They are one-sidedly affirming a pagan Ciceronian view of religious worship, and at the same time choosing not to make St. Augustine, who was the rival authority on the issue, their main source for their doctrine on latria. Cicero is indeed the earliest among the sources available in Latin in the 13th century on the topic of religious worship. Cicero was not, of course, the first thinker to address the phenomenon of religious worship from a philosophical perspective. Plato's Euthyphro is an earlier instance of a robust philosophical discussion on the nature of religious piety or holiness. And Cicero is very likely influenced heavily by the Platonic doctrine of piety via the Academy, given that in his early De Rhetorica Inventione, he largely echoes the doctrine contained in the Euthyphro. Thus, although the Euthyphro was not available to Albert and his contemporaries, it is the Platonic doctrine of piety that Cicero is channeling to the Middle Ages. The discussion in Cicero, however, reaches greater complexity than in Plato. Cicero makes precise definitions and divisions of virtues, giving a full outline of justice and its parts. Whereas in the Euthyphro, Socrates had tentatively hypothesized that piety is to be categorized as the part of justice that deals with the service of the gods, in his rhetoric, Cicero categorically places religio as a subset of jus, which offers care and reverence to a certain superior nature, which they call divine. This definition was well known to 13th century Latin thinkers and became at the time one of the two competing views on religious worship. A second source on religious worship for Albert and his contemporaries, one whose authority in the Latin Middle Ages usually had more weight than that of Cicero, was Augustine and his discussion of latria and de civitate Dei. There, Augustine decidedly steers away from the Ciceronian view together with all other pagan accounts of religion. One of his concerns there is to establish a rigorous terminology of worship that avoids equivocation between pagan, polytheistic worship and the worship of the one true God, namely the Christian God. To this end, he first establishes the biblical principle that, quote, all the gods of the Gentiles are devils, but the Lord made the heavens, Psalm 95:5. That is, quote, that the many false gods the Christian truth shows to be useless images, or unclean spirits and pernicious demons, or certainly creatures, not the Creator, end quote. The radical separation between these two objects of religious worship will, for him, imply a radical separation between kinds of religious worship. He insists that in order to avoid confusion, the special type of worship due to the one true God is to be named in a non-equivocal way. Now, since he can find no Latin term fit for this reality, he decides to have recourse to the Greek language in order to name it accurately. Quote, for this is the worship which is due to the divinity, or, to speak more accurately, to the deity. And to express this worship in a single word, as there does not occur to me any Latin term sufficiently exact, I shall avail myself whenever necessary of a Greek word, end quote. And in the Greek of the Septuagint, he finds there are three terms that are adequate: latria, or latria, thriskia, and theosebia. He thus tells us that, quote, in some passages of Scripture, the sacred writers have preferred, so that the distinction appear more decidedly, to say not eusebia, which is literally a composite out of good worship, but theosebia, which is literally a composite out of the worship of God, and that accordingly the false gods are not to be worshipped with that rite and service which the Greeks call latria, and which is due to the one true God, end quote. Thus Augustine establishes the terminology used to denote the worship of the one true God in the De Civitate Dei. Whereas in the De Trinitate, he explicitly distinguishes two types of service, the one owed to creatures and another owed to the Creator. Quote, it is sufficiently clear that the Holy Spirit is not a creature, hence we are commanded not to serve a creature but the Creator, not in that way in which we are commanded through charity to serve one another, which in Greek is doulein, which is to offer doulia, but in that way in which only God is served, which is in Greek latrain, or to offer latria, end quote. In his Enchiridion, he goes further by specifying the nature of divine worship. There, while commenting on a passage from the book of Job, he states that the term pietas of the Latin text of that passage is equivalent to the Greek term theosebia, which denotes the worship due to God alone. He then identifies the nature of this theosebia as consisting in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Quote, perhaps you are anxious that I should gather together in a short discourse the proper mode of worshiping God. God is to be worshipped with faith, hope, and love, end quote. The rest of the book will be dedicated to gathering together, in his words, the object of these three virtues, presupposing throughout that divine worship consists in them. This Augustinian notion of latria, or theosebia, as consisting in the theological virtues, thus became in Albert's time the rival of the Ciceronian notion of religio as part of justice. As is well documented by Odin Lotin, the early scholastics noticed this tension among their sources, took it seriously, and made an effort to find a synthesis between the two models. Some scholastic masters presented the notions of latria and religio as being related but distinct, while others sought to arrive at a more complex synthesis by subordinating one to the other as a part to a whole. William of Auxerre, for example, explicitly set up an irreducible distinction between the Ciceronian religio and the Augustinian latria as respectively pagan and Christian expressions of worship. He included faith as one of the acts of latria and understood it in contraposition to the Ciceronian sense of religio. He argues that, quote, latria, according to the Catholic, includes more than religio, according to the pagan philosophers, for philosophers do not attain faith or the gift of wisdom. Hence, religio, according to them, includes only the reverence that we owe to God in sacrifice and prayer, end quote. Others were unafraid of simultaneously accepting the definition given by Cicero and assigning to this virtue some of the acts proper to the theological virtues. Peter Lombard, Simon of Tournai, Alan of Lille, all claimed that religio included the love of God among other things. Philip the Chancellor, John of La Rochelle, the Summa Fratris Alexandri, Odon Rigaud, and St. Bonaventure listed some or all of the theological virtues under latria, which itself is categorized as a part of justice. St. Bonaventure's synthesis represents the climax of the trend of fusing together latria and the cardinal virtues. He found in Peter Lombard's distinction between cultus and servitus a strategy for fitting the theological virtues within the general virtue of latria. He cites Augustine as saying that the Greek term latria signifies service or servitus, but theosebia and eusebia signify divine worship or cultus divinus. Then he notes that, on the one hand, servitus pertains to external activity and thus is within the genus of the cardinal virtues, and specifically within justice. But on the other hand, cultus pertains more properly to interior worship and thus to the theological virtues. In this way, he believes that he has resolved the tension between Augustinian and Ciceronian authorities. Yet, ultimately, the effort that these schoolmen invested in harmonizing or properly distinguishing between the Augustinian latria and pagan religio, would be fruitless within the Dominican tradition. It is within this context that Albert's apparently innocuous citation of Cicero above must be evaluated. He is setting the record straight, so to speak, by citing very firmly with Cicero in his model of religio, closely associating latria and religio as belonging to the same virtue, and classifying this virtue firmly under the cardinal virtue of justice. He thereby departs from the syntheses of his predecessors and contemporaries that aimed at harmonizing the Ciceronian religio with the theological Augustinian model, and instead embraces wholeheartedly the pagan philosophical model as the correct one. Now, even though Albert did most of the work in this respect, Aquinas must be given the credit of being the first to make the move of fully identifying Augustine's latria and Cicero's religio as synonymous. Unlike Aquinas, Albert did not identify religio and latria. He still tries to distinguish the two, if only in a subtle way, perhaps out of respect for the tradition that he's working with. He labors to explain that, strictly speaking, latria refers to the worship itself of God, whereas religio to the corresponding religious observance or observancia that is in us with regard to God. This explains why Albert's entire discussion in his sentences commentary is framed in the language of latria as a virtue, which is the language used by Lombard, with only a few strategic mentions of the term religio, whereas in the discussion in Aquinas' sentences commentary, the terms are used interchangeably. In the Summa Theologiae, the discussion is mostly framed in the language of the virtue of religio, and I mean, this is Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. It's framed in the language of the virtue of religio, with frequent uses or instances of the word latria, sometimes as a synonym for the virtue of religio, and sometimes as references specifically to the acts of the virtue of religion. But the salient point here is that Albert is already committed to a virtual reduction of the Augustinian teaching on latria to the virtue of justice, and hence to the Ciceronian teaching on religion, and that Aquinas could hardly have made the final reduction of latria to religio had Albert not led the way. One major consequence of Albert's work on latria is that for the first time in Christian thought, it locates the discussion on religious worship fully within the realm of moral philosophy, as opposed to moral theology. As part of the virtue of justice, latria can now be studied and analyzed within the context of the philosophical science of ethics, and in particular within the context of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. In addressing the different questions on the matter, Albert is not only making an effort to answer in a way that is coherent with the principles of philosophical ethics, he's explicitly looking for guidance from Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, despite the fact that this work does not address the issue of religious worship. For example, when discussing the question of whether latria is a virtue at all, he considers many arguments, first for the view that it is not a virtue, and then for the view that it is a virtue. One of the arguments for the negative thesis is based on the premise, taken from Aristotle's Ethics, that a virtue lies in a golden mean between extremes, whereas presumably it is not possible to give God too much worship to an extreme, or more than is his due. He replies to this argument by offering a more profound understanding of the golden mean doctrine, saying that for Aristotle the golden mean in some virtues lies in right reason, and this is the case in latria. Also, when addressing arguments for the affirmative thesis, that latria is a virtue, he agrees with the argument's conclusion that latria is a virtue, but disagrees with them insofar as their premises are not consistent with the Nicomachean ethics. Quote, regarding the arguments offered to the contrary view, i.e. that it is a virtue, although their conclusion is true, and they are the arguments of the magistri, nonetheless they are not from those things that are proper to ethics. End quote. This approach to worship as a fundamentally philosophical category, which can be analyzed through the principles of Aristotle's ethics, is quite novel within the theological setting in which Albert and Aquinas are working. Their immediate predecessors were unable to discuss latria in this way, not only because Aristotle's ethics were too recent to discovery, but also because they regarded latria as being intimately bound up with the theological virtues, and hence thought that only Christian theology was able to discuss its proper place among the virtues. Albert is thus breaking new ground by violently recontextualizing the discussion. And Aquinas will be the direct beneficiary of this move, given that Aquinas' doctrine on religio is fundamentally nestled within the novel context that he directly inherited from Albert. Aquinas is obviously deeply indebted to Albert on this point. Section 2. The scope of action in latria. Yet, as a groundbreaker, Albert's approach can hardly be expected to be comprehensive or seamlessly coherent. As he works out the details of his doctrine of latria within the new philosophical context, one sees him struggling with some issues. For example, that of the scope of action of latria. One can appreciate the relative sketchiness of his approach if one compares the details of his account of religio with the synthesis offered by his disciple from Roca Seca. When discussing exactly what latria consists in, Albert considers an argument, framed perhaps from a Bonaventurian perspective, to the effect that worship consists in exterior or physical actions, like prostrations, genuflections, etc., whereas a virtue resides in the will, and so worship cannot be a virtue. His response is that many actions can belong materially to worship so long as they are all formally done qua worship or cultus. The formal ratio of worship is what unites all those actions as acts of a single virtue. Quote, worship consists materially in many actions, but formally in one, namely, the exhibiting of worship and testimony of the honor due to the Creator, because He is God or the Creator. For that ratio is one in many actions and unites them all. End quote. Yet, despite the ability of latria to encompass many diverse actions, for Albert there is a rather strict limit as to which acts count as acts of latria, at least in comparison with other thinkers like Plato, Augustine, Averroes, Maimonides, Bonaventure, and Aquinas, who seem to allow non-cultic acts as being somehow within the scope of religious worship. Albert even explicitly says that, strictly speaking, quote, going to church or sitting and standing, presumably within the context of a church service, are not acts of any virtue, even though they can be meritorious acts, end quote. Whereas for Aquinas, these actions would certainly be acts commanded by the virtue of religio, if not elicited by it, as we shall see below. The reason why Albert is so restrictive with regards to which acts constitute latria can be better appreciated within the context of his understanding of the Christian teaching that all human acts, whether of latria or of some other virtue, should be done for the glory of God. In this regard, Albert considers an argument that claims that the virtue of latria has an unlimited scope of action. The argument cites the authority of Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he admonishes them, quote, whether you eat or drink or whatever else you do, do all to the glory of God, end quote. It's 1 Corinthians 10:31. Hence, the argument concludes, we are to serve God through all of our actions, and hence all of our actions can count as acts of latria. But Albert responds that there is an important difference between properly cultic acts, or acts of religious worship, and simply having rectitude of intention in one's non-cultic acts. Quote, one thing is to do something for the glory of the Lord, and another is to refer something to the worship of God, because the former regards rectitude of intention only, whereas the latter regards the rectitude of worship and of the due honor exhibited to God, end quote. Albert further explains this rectitude of intention in Aristotelian terms when he distinguishes latria from dulia. He considers the argument that latria and dulia have God as a common end, and hence that they are the same virtue. In his reply, he distinguishes between the finis operis, or finis actus huius vel ilius, the proximate end of each human action, which gives each virtue its species, and the finis intentionis universalis, the desire of the ultimate end, which directs all of our actions, which is common to all virtues, and which therefore does not diversify virtues according to species. He adds that the proximate end of latria are the divine ceremonies, cerimonia divina. Thus it is clear that for him, an act of latria is not just any act that is done for God's glory, but an act that aims to offer to God some religious ceremony. And the same cannot be said of dulia. Aquinas' explanation of the same reality, however, is in a sense consistent with Albert's, but Aquinas will emphatically allow for the acts of other virtues to be also acts of religio, at least in some way. To address this question, Aquinas utilizes a distinction between the elicited and commanded acts of a virtue. Quote, "Nothing hinders an act that is proper to a virtue elicitedly from being attributed to another virtue as commanding it and directing it to its end." And in this way, almsgiving is counted among works of satisfaction insofar as pity for the defect of a subject is ordered to the satisfaction of sin, and insofar as it is directed to placate God, it has the nature of a sacrifice, and thus it is commanded by latria. End quote. Thus, as a virtue has, on the one hand, acts that are proper to it, Aquinas calls these the elicited acts of a virtue. Visiting one's father, paying signs of respect to him, etc., are examples of the elicited acts of the virtue of piety. On the other hand, a virtue can borrow, as it were, the acts that are proper to other virtues, ordering them or commanding them to its own proper end, and giving them a new formality. That is, the act of a virtue has its own natural end, but it can be ordered or commanded by a higher virtue to that virtue's own end. These Aquinas calls the commanded acts of a virtue. And the example that Aquinas gives, an act of almsgiving, which is normally done for the sake of relieving the poor, can be elevated to an ulterior end, namely that of placating God by the virtue of satisfaction, which is a part of charity. Another example could be how the virtue of piety can command an act of fortitude, as when a son joins the armed forces in order to honor his father. In this case, the act of obtaining an arduous good is the natural end of fortitude, but it is elevated by piety to the ulterior end of honoring the father. Aquinas brings this teaching to the fore in his discussion on religion in the Summa Theologiae. There he tackles an argument that cites the Epistle of James 1:27. Quote, "Religion clean and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their tribulation and to keep oneself immaculate from this world." End quote. But visiting orphans and widows, the argument says, seems not to concern religious ceremonies or cultic acts, but the care of neighbor, etc. In his reply, Aquinas will reach a conclusion that significantly departs from Albert's approach in the sentence's commentary. He will utilize the doctrine of elicited and commanded acts of religion to explain how even those non-cultic acts fall within the virtue of religion. Quote, "Religion has two kinds of act. Certain proper and immediate acts, which it elicits, through which man is ordered to God alone, such as to sacrifice, to adore, and other similar things. And it has other acts, which it produces by means of the virtues, which it commands, ordering them to divine reverence. For the virtue to which the end pertains commands the virtues to which the means pertain. And according to this, to visit orphans and widows in their tribulation, which is an act elicited by the virtue of mercy, is put forward as an act of religion by way of command. And to keep oneself clean from this world as an act commanded by religion, but elicited by temperance or some other such like virtue." End quote. Thus the principal acts of the virtue of religion are its elicited acts, such as adoration, prayer, and sacrifice. These are directly elicited by the virtue of religion because they have no other finality than to give honor to God. They are the acts that are proper to the virtue of religion. But since the virtue of religion can also command the acts of any other moral virtue to its own ends, it follows that there are also other secondary or indirect religious acts, such as chastity and martyrdom, which, though directly elicited by other moral virtues, for example, temperance and fortitude, are commanded by the virtue of religion in such a way that religion orders them to a higher religious end. Thus, the acts of essentially non-religious virtues can all be transformed into indirectly religious acts by being commanded to a religious end. In every act of religion, whether elicited or commanded by the virtue of religion, the will is ordering something to the honor of God as to its end. Otherwise, the act would not count as religion at all. What is most noteworthy in Aquinas' account, for our purposes, is his position on the universal scope of the virtue of religio. This is clearly a development in Aquinas that takes him beyond his master Albert. Religio, for Aquinas, does not just incline human beings to pray, offer sacrifice, genuflect, etc., but also to order their entire lives, all of their acts of virtue, of whatever kind, to the honor or glory of God as to their end. And for Aquinas, this ability to order all of human life to God is not peripheral to religio. Rather, it is precisely why religio is a virtue in Aquinas' view. He explicitly accounts for its being a virtue on the basis that it, quote, orders humans to God. This order to God is the good that the virtue of religion obtains for us. Quote, "A virtue is that which makes its possessor good, and his act good likewise. Hence, we must say that every good act belongs to a virtue. Now it is evident that to render anyone their due has the aspect of good, since by rendering someone their due, one is also placed in a suitable relation to them, as though fittingly ordered to them. Now order comes under the aspect of good, just as mode and species, according to Augustine in his book De Natura Boni. Since then it belongs to religion to pay due honor to someone, namely to God, it is evident that religion is a virtue. End quote. Therefore, given its commanding role, the virtue of religion has a certain generality, a kind of universal applicability in relation to the other moral virtues. For Aquinas, religio is in a sense the virtue, or at least one of the virtues, that is specified by that finis intentionis universalis, of which Albert speaks, and which in Albert does not specify any virtue. This is why Aquinas identifies the role of religio as one of the general virtues, over and above its role as a special virtue. As a general virtue, religio takes on the name of sanctity, or sanctitas, in Aquinas' moral philosophy. That is, insofar as this virtue elicits acts proper to itself, it is called religion, but insofar as it commands the acts of other virtues, ordering them to divine honor, it is called sanctity. Quote, thus, that through which the mind of man applies itself and its acts to God is called sanctity. Hence, it does not differ from religion according to its essence, but only conceptually, or ratione. For it is called religion according as it shows to God due service in those things that pertain specifically to divine cultus, such as in sacrifices, oblations, and other such like things. But it is called sanctity according as man refers to God not only these, but also the works of the other virtues, or according as man disposes himself by means of good works to divine cultus. End quote. And again, quote, sanctity is a certain special virtue according to its essence, and according to this, it is in a way the same as religion. It has a certain generality, however, insofar as by its command it directs the acts of all the virtues to the divine good, just as legal justice is said to be a general virtue insofar as it directs the acts of all the virtues to the common good. End quote. This goes to show that practically any act can count as an act of sanctity, that is, of religion as a commanding virtue, so long as it is good and so long as it is ordered to God as to an end. Not only can any virtuous act become an act of sanctity, but even otherwise morally indifferent acts can be transformed into virtuous acts of sanctity. An entire life, in fact, if ordered to God as to an end, can be transformed into an act of the virtue of sanctity. Therefore, in order to live a complete life of virtue, one needs not only to perform acts that are elicited by the virtue of religion, such as prayer and sacrifice. The truly virtuous person will in fact elevate the acts elicited by all the other moral virtues, such as acts of temperance and fortitude, by ordering them to a religious end, thus transforming them into commanded acts of religion. Consequently, we can say that in Aquinas, there is a religious ethics that goes well beyond Albert's moral thought. For Aquinas, the whole life of the virtuous man is in its most profound sense a life of religio, because it is governed or commanded by that virtue, and a life lived in such a way receives the name of sanctity. 3. Latria and the theological virtues. Albert's move of locating latria within the virtue of justice, as opposed to the theological virtues, immediately raises the question of how latria relates to the theological virtues. Even if worship is something that humans owe to God in justice, there remains a seemingly obvious connection, at least from a Christian point of view, between loving, hoping, and believing in God, and giving Him what is His due through worship. What exactly is that connection? Here we also see significant differences between Albert's and Aquinas' accounts. While discussing the definition of latria, Albert considers an argument to the effect that latria means service, but believing in God and loving God are a service that are due to Him, and the same could even be said of hoping in God. Therefore, the argument concludes, the virtues of faith, hope, and charity are also a form of latria. In a way that is consistent with his account of the scope of latria, Albert replies by explaining that the same act of believing or loving can materially belong to different virtues, but that act will be informed differently by each virtue. Quote, believing, loving, and hoping signify acts which can be material with respect to the act of this virtue of latria. For example, if one were to believe or love with the intention of professing one's worship of God in testimony of the honor that is due to him. But nonetheless, believing, loving, and hoping name the acts of faith, charity, and hope, and thus of the others. Hence, believing in this in its own ratio does not regard the service of worship, but rather the assent to the first truth. Similarly, charity regards the ratio of first goodness, and thus of the others. And thus they are distinct from the act of latria, for it is not unfitting for one act, which is not proper but common, to belong to different virtues if it is informed by diverse differentiae. End quote. He also addresses why latria is distinct from faith in particular, because, quote, although faith shows us what it is that is to be worshipped, nonetheless it does not move us to worship as a proper habit of this act, but rather it moves us to believe, end quote. Moreover, in the same section of the sentence commentary, we also see Albert incidentally describing charity as a sort of mover in all good works, in reference to meritorious acts that do not strictly speaking pertain to any particular virtue, but are elicited by charity for the sake of serving God, such as going to church, sitting, and standing. This thesis will of course be a precursor to Aquinas' more developed account of charity as the form of all the virtues, and which he uses to explain charity's relation to religio in particular. But in Albert's text we do not see beyond this any further explanation of how charity relates to latria. Aquinas' explanation of how religio relates to the theological virtues, then, is considerably more complex. He not only distinguishes religio from the theological virtues, but also explains their relation and interaction. Aquinas will defend this classification of religion as a moral virtue as opposed to a theological virtue by appealing to his doctrine on the end and object of the virtues. In Aquinas' ethics, as in Albert's, virtues are classified as theological or human depending on their matter or object. The theological virtues have God as their object, whereas the human or natural virtues have creatures as their objects. For example, the object of the virtue of justice, a natural or human virtue, is that which is due to others, whereas the object of the theological virtue of faith is God himself. With regard to religion, Aquinas says that God is not its object, but its end, and so it is not a theological virtue, but a moral one. Quote, religion is what offers God due worship. Therefore, two things are considered in religion. One is what religion offers, namely worship, and this is related to religion as matter and object. The other is that to which it is offered, that is, to God. To God, worship is shown not as if the acts whereby God is worshipped attain God himself, as when we believe in God, by believing we attain God, but rather due worship is offered to God insofar as certain acts whereby God is worshipped are done for the sake of the reverence of God. For example, the offering of sacrifices and other such things. Hence it is manifest that God is not related to the virtue of religion as matter or object, but as end. Therefore, religion is not a theological virtue whose object is the ultimate end, but rather it is a moral virtue to which it belongs to be about the means. End quote. Theological virtues are the highest virtues in Aquinas' system because they directly have God as their object of operation, and because the virtue of religion has God only as its end and not its object, it cannot be a theological virtue. Yet despite their distinction, there is a profound parallel between the theological virtue of charity and the moral virtue of religio in Aquinas. In the same way that religio can command the acts elicited by lower moral virtues, its own acts can themselves be commanded by higher virtues. That is to say, the theological virtues can command the acts elicited by religio and guide them to their own proper ends. Quote, by its command, the power or virtue that operates with regards to the end always moves the power or virtue that performs the means. Now, the theological virtues, namely faith, hope, and charity, have an act with regards to God as with regards to their proper object, and therefore, by their command, they cause the act of religion, which performs certain things directed towards God. And therefore, Augustine says that God is worshipped by faith, hope, and charity. End quote. Therefore, religio is to all other moral virtues what charity is to religio, as well as to all the virtues without qualification. Charity is said to be the form of the virtues because it commands the acts of all those other virtues, ordering them to the ultimate supernatural end of loving God. Without charity, therefore, the entire supernatural organism of virtues is formless or lifeless and loses its order, more or less like a corpse begins to decay because it has lost its substantial form. Hence we see that Albert and Aquinas differ considerably in their explanation of the relationship between the theological virtues and latria, an issue so central to the predecessors' debate over the tension between Augustinian latria and Ciceronian religio. Some of Albert's views are precursors to Aquinas', but Aquinas' account is clearly more complex, in that not only he distinguishes religio from the theological virtues, but also explains the relation and interaction in a more elaborate way. Conclusion. In this paper I have shown how Albert and Aquinas addressed some of the same questions concerning religious worship and shared similar views at a very fundamental level, yet in the details Aquinas' account is evidently more developed and sophisticated. Aquinas takes Albert's account as settling some issues, as for example the question of how latria is to be entirely categorized under the virtue of justice, following the authority of Cicero, and not under the theological virtues, as earlier predecessors had suggested in light of Augustine's teachings. But surprisingly, Aquinas often diverges from Albert, or goes beyond him and offers alternative, more comprehensive approaches. One instance is Aquinas' full identification of latria and religio, a move which Albert himself never made. Also, Aquinas' account of the range of action of the virtue of latria goes well beyond that of Albert. For Aquinas there are many virtuous acts that are not per se cultic, but which are acts of religio as commanded by that virtue, whereas Albert would categorize those same acts entirely outside of the virtue of latria. Also, the specific problem of how latria relates to the theological virtues is addressed in different ways by these two authors, Aquinas' account being the most detailed. In this paper I have attempted to make a contribution to the scholarship on Aquinas' account of the virtue of religion by identifying both its originality and its debt to Albert's account of latria. In general, I hope I have successfully highlighted an instance that illustrates well Aquinas' indebtedness to and development of the thought of his master Albert. Thank you very much.